Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Kristy Taylor, and welcome to another episode of DEI Conversations, where I am here with the awesome Dr. Sarah Ratekin, founder of Happiness is Courage. Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into tonight's conversation.
Ooh, Kristy, I'm excited for this one. So hi, everybody. I am Sarah Ratekin. I am a Chief Happiness Officer and researcher really focused on what it is that creates positive workplace experiences. So, Kristy, we have an awesome topic tonight. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, we're going to talk about barriers or bridges, how to transform workplace challenges. In the last couple of episodes, we have really been focused on just this general conversation about the necessity of DEI. And, everybody's so scared to approach the topic. But when you look at it from the impact of how it impacts your work environment, your team dynamics, it's still an important topic to discuss because you can frame it as organizational development, organizational culture, workplace happiness, however you want to frame it. But an orange, even if I call it an orange purple, it's still known as an orange, right? And so that's how we're kind of looking at it. It's not about the great debates around race or gender or sex. I mean, that's a part of the DEI topic, but we're really looking at this as how these conversations help to improve the work environment. Now, workplace challenges, they can either create division, they can serve as opportunities, or they can serve as opportunities for growth. And it's all about how we respond. And part of that, again, is just being culturally competent, understanding not only the dynamics of the individuals that you work with, but also your organization. And so today we're really focusing on how to turn that conflict into a chance to really strengthen your relationships and drive inclusivity. And so we hope that through this discussion today that we can talk about, and me, I'm big on my framework, which is really focused on that accountability piece and behavior change. Same with you in these last few conversations that we've had, Sarah, just talking to you in general, right? The fostering these compassionate, accountable work environments where we have open communication. So knowing that your whole focus and how excited you are about tonight has been to foster these happy and creative work environments, I want to kick this discussion off tonight by turning it over to you, Sarah, just really by starting off by asking, what are some of the most common barriers to inclusivity in organizations? And from your perspective, how can those barriers be addressed?
I think when I look at the organizations that I have worked with, I see three common themes that crop up time and time again. We see unconscious bias, that is just a huge problem within all organizations of all industries. We see a lack of representation, and that means a lot of different things. And we also see not just a resistance to change, but I think what we're seeing now is actually change fatigue. People are overwhelmed by the amount of change that they've had to wrestle with over the last 3 to 5 years. And they're exhausted. We are exhausted trying to navigate this. And the common narrative is kind of like change is the new normal. And that's real and not super helpful when it comes to actually fixing it. Some of the ways I've seen people work on these topics that are more successful than others. When we look at unconscious bias, I think that's where accountability comes into play. We have to acknowledge that bias is real. All humans carry conscious and unconscious bias. That's pretty well documented.
Say that again.
I mean, it's just real. And I think anybody who pretends otherwise is either lying to themselves or has suffered a head trauma, because bias is a piece of the human experience. I think it's probably a piece of the mammalian experience, but that's just real. So conscious bias is a different conversation. I think that's a different beast to tackle. But unconscious bias is something that we don't understand we're carrying around with us. So acknowledging that we have it, and then doing the intellectual labor to address it and try to figure out where that unconscious bias is tripping us up and how we can have a more broad-based approach to life. I think infusing more curiosity and less judgment is a great way to start that approach. But just acknowledging it in the first place is the first step towards the personal accountability that comes with addressing unconscious bias. And there are workshops and YouTube videos and LinkedIn learnings and all kinds of opportunities for people, both leaders and individual contributors, to really tackle unconscious bias. When I think about lack of representation, though, this is where I think it gets really tricky, because when we think about representation, what I see happen is the visible demographic differences between people may or may not get addressed in organizations. Like I have some clients who set DEI targets based on percentages. Like we want to see X percent of our leadership cohort made up of Y demographic, gender, ethnicity, religion. It depends on the organization. But that doesn't take into consideration the real complexity of the diversity landscape, right? The invisible differences that people carry with them, neurodivergence, sexual orientation, even gender can be a complicated conversation topic. So I think you have to first have a really good grasp of what we're talking about when we talk about representation, and then find ways that don't slide into that kind of tokenism behavior where you see the pretty pictures on the website and you can clearly see that there's more female faces or more faces that are of different shades of skin tone that are represented. I think that's a really easy way out, but it doesn't really get to the core needs around representation. And then really quickly, when it comes to change, I think a big piece of it right now is because we're not just talking about change literacy, but we're really talking about change fatigue. I really don't think that companies can accomplish anything until they acknowledge that everybody is exhausted and they take just a moment to pause and let people catch their breath. And I know that in today's fast-paced business world, you can't stop for 6 months and do no work, but you can acknowledge that everybody is just frazzled and try to weave in small moments where people have a chance to breathe and bring their executive function back online. Because until that happens, nobody's making good decisions. But speaking of good decisions, these are all huge, huge opportunities for growth. So when we think about conflict and how it does provide us opportunities for growth in your work, how do you see professionals able to kind of reframe these conversations so it's not just this like litany of complaints, but really it is a legitimate opportunity to change things for the better?
Well, first, let me address what you said about conscious and unconscious bias, because I love that ideology of change fatigue. Honey, we are tired. One thing I forgot to ask before we started, because this is drink, eat, and intelligent conversation. And we got the conversation, but what are you drinking? You know, me, water. What do you have for your snacks?
You know me, it's coffee, and I have apple slices tonight. I'm trying to be healthy.
Oh. Well, I managed to stuff down a pork chop before we started.
That sounds better than an apple.
Yeah, and I don't know, because I went over to Panera Bread after I got off of work today and also bought some soup, but that wasn't enough, so I just managed to scarf down a pork chop before we started. I'm a good old country Southern girl, so. But look, you know, people are tired. And I think that's the first thing is, you know, like we see a lot out there of, there's a lot of classism, a lot of racism. There's a lot of dynamics that is going on. And we don't even realize sometimes we are literally stepping on our own feet, right? When it comes to this stuff. And people are tired. I mean, it is it's a wheel that continuously goes around. And I think the first thing to admit is that people are human and they are tired. And even though we push and push and push, you know, when you're doing this type of organizational development work, we always say change is good. You have to be adaptable. You have to be flexible. You have to be, what's all the buzzwords, agile, right? But people, like you say, people are tired. Now, conflict is going to happen. This is why it's so important that we actually understand, like you mentioned, I always say, okay, in my framework, I kept the A right, because, you know, when we're talking about accessibility, disability, I was interviewing one guy. He said, hey, I changed the word DEIA to idea, right? We need to get the idea. I love that. But speaking of ideas, it's like when you're dealing with conflict or you're seeking to try to understand things, one part of it is just like shifting perspective, right? I used to teach these classes in cultural competence, and it's like I've said this before on this podcast. It's like, hey, people don't know what they don't know. Now, it's conscious biases. If you're making a choice to be a sexist or racist, that's a conscious choice that a person is making, and they're wrong for that. But recognizing that we're all human and we've all had different experiences, and the unconscious bias start when you go into a conversation about unconscious bias. I'm gonna tell you where we messed up, especially as facilitators, is when we go into those conversations and we take our feelings into it. Like if I go into this conversation as a Black woman and I go, I know history, I'm a history professor, so you know I know it, right? But if I go into those conversations as a Black woman and I go in with the this is what y'all did, everybody racist, and right, and not start the conversation. Like in all of my cultural competency classes, I would go, listen, I grew up in Mississippi. We had two races of people, black and white. I didn't know anything else, right? If you grew up in the Midwest and you only see a white person, that does not make you racist. It just means that we all have different experiences. So I would start these conversations off like, hey, let's have a respect for experiences, and you'll realize that if you have unconscious bias, it is literally just because you've only seen or been exposed to individuals based on what you saw in the news or the media. And that does not make you racist. It does not make you stupid. It might be some ignorance in terms of, we have to really be careful with that word, right? Because people will use it out of context when they're like, well, Sarah, you're ignorant. No, it's just ignorance in terms of not knowing, because when you actually look up the definition of ignorance, it just means not knowing, not understanding. It doesn't make you prejudiced because you don't know. Now, if you come into an awareness that you have this unconscious level of bias, now you're conscious. Guess what? Now you're conscious, right? And so you have to take the necessary steps. It does not mean that you have to don a dashiki during Black History Month, okay? You know what I mean? But what it does mean is just like, okay, we got different cultures. We come from different backgrounds, and it's just an opportunity, for maybe I'll have those. Maybe there's a place where I could have those conversations. And even if work is not the place, right? I understand what I don't understand. And if we're not going to talk about those things in the workplace, what I do understand about myself is that I don't understand everything. So I'm just going to try to, from a humanist standpoint, to respect the differences of other people, and when I do have to engage with them on a more intimate level, I'm going to try to understand their mindset. So when you talk about answering the question, I went all around the world with that. But when I wanted to explain that, because I think that we don't go into these conversations without, approaching it with some level of reality that this is what we're dealing with, right, on a day-to-day basis. So you got to focus on, when I talk about now that you're in the know, shifting that perspective, looking at conflict, learning from when it comes to conflict, you got to view disagreements as valuable feedback about different perspectives. And you got to recognize that you might not understand everybody's perspective, and you might seek to. Now, when I say I'm trying to understand your perspective, Sarah, that does not mean that I need you to start picturing Sicily in 1920, right? I'm saying, like, what is the issue right here, right now? Why is this that you might be thinking this way? But it's not, because I think what happens within the context of these DEI conversations, people start thinking that it's therapy. Now, but sometimes it can turn into, may feel like that when you get so touchy-feely, but sometimes the conversations are necessary so that we can better understand each other's experience. And then, I'm gonna just say two other things here. The answer to that question is like my framework, that rational motor behavior therapy framework that I use, it focuses on self-assessment. And so when we're talking about dealing with conflict and learning with other people, knowing that you don't know everything, first of all, you got to identify your triggers. You got to learn to reflect on your own emotional responses. You got to understand why so while I'm saying on one hand, you should be seeking to understand other people, then you also need to understand yourself, and you got to learn to pause before you react. Do you really have to send that email right now just to one up that person? And by you engaging and developing your own emotional intelligence in the workplace as well, in your own personal growth, you're going to be cultivating a growth mindset, and you're going to be more open to collaboration and more solutions focused. I wish that this discussion where we're going to be all just equal all of a sudden, after all of these many years of history where the playing field is not even. I'm going to speak from a cultural perspective for a second. Just because one rapper makes it or one football player makes it in my culture, for example, that does not mean that we all have made it, right? You have systemic and systematic issues that are still barriers. So you still got a group of people, even gender-wise, who are running a race with their foot chopped off, still trying to catch up. But then all of a sudden, you can't just get to 20, 25 and go, hey, we're all equal. It's all there. It's all, we're done. So, like I said, these can be challenging topics to approach, but we got to approach it in a real manner, not be emotional about it, but just that's why we're doing this podcast, because it's people who focus on workplace engagement and improvement, right? We understand from an OD standpoint, when I say OD, organizational development standpoint, the impact. So when you go in a lot, Sarah, and you work with teams, right? And my question to you is like, you know, these people don't know everything about each other, right? So how do you, when you work and you talk about this ideology of happiness in the workplace, as if we can be happy, right? How do you really focus on, you know, building trust, fostering that open communication, and managing those, helping to navigate those tensions?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's acknowledging that it exists, right? I mean, there is so much hesitancy around even admitting that there's a challenge in this space. People really would prefer, I've had people say, can't we just pretend everything's fine? And it reminds me of some other conversations like, can't we all just get along, right? And the answer is no, we can't. Not in today's moment, right? And so one of the things I think is overused but is actually really accurate is psychological safety. And there are lots and lots and lots of articles and worksheets and conversations around psychological safety. But I think this podcast is a great example. You and I can have a conversation about really complicated topics coming from very different places, and we know that we're going to respect each other's voices. We're not going to judge each other for the things that we say, and we're going to learn in the process. And so I think when organizations can approach the topic of psychological safety from a place of authenticity and not a place of checking a box on some corporate initiative list, they can make huge strides, because when people can have the kinds of conversations around conscious bias, when they can have unconscious bias, when they can talk about lack of access, barriers to professional growth, personal growth, when they can do that in a way that feels safe, they can actually have real conversations and they can come up with solutions that get to the core problems. Otherwise, they're just slapping a Band-Aid on something that's nasty that's not going to get any better. And I think the other piece of that is growing our own empathy and curiosity is a huge step. What I see is there's so much fear on top of the exhaustion for a zillion reasons. I mean, people have come through complicated workplace environments. They've just dealt with a global situation, lots of global situations, actually, that are simultaneously happening. Yes. And that, right, people are afraid. And again, when people are afraid and tired, their brains stop working. And so why would we think, who thinks anybody's going to come up with good solutions when they can't use the cognitive piece of their brain? We're kind of all just in lizard mode, like just trying to survive to the next day right now. So bringing curiosity into the conversation as opposed to fear and judgment changes the entire experience. It takes a little practice to flip that narrative so people don't feel like they're being judged through the questions that are being asked. But when people understand each other's working styles, when they do know what their own and others' stress triggers are, things like the personality assessments, team building exercises, these are things people can really use to get to know each other as humans and to interact on that human to human level. And when you see your coworkers as fellow humans who are trying to accomplish the same things that you're trying to accomplish, it completely changes the game. When you see people as competition for resources, of course, that's a little bit different conversation, and typically a whole lot more toxic. And to make any of this happen, communication is crucial. And communication is one of the skills that is routinely graded as not so hot in corporate settings. The National Association of Colleges and Employers pulled it out as one of the skills that college graduates need to have to be successful, and that most employers say that college graduates don't have very, very high levels of, which is a bad tension. But I would argue that it's not just college graduates that are struggling with communication. When we have so many different generations in the workplace, we've got so many different complicated factors coming into these conversations, and we have tensions of like epic levels, communication becomes a whole lot more complicated. So thinking about communication, what communication techniques have you found in your work that are really effective for fostering this understanding that people need to be able to collaborate with each other?
Yeah, I'm going to start with that. What I just gave you as an example, like from the facilitator standpoint, right? Because as people who do this type of work, when we're running events or classes, workshops, we set the tone. So I'm going to talk about every day in a minute, but if you're facilitating, you got to go in by starting the conversation in a way where people can relate to you and break down the walls. That's why I always be like, well, I'm from Mississippi. I just ate a pork chop. Like I just try to break down the walls because I know people probably expect me to come on this podcast, which is called Drink, Eat, and Intelligent Conversation, and be like, hi, my name is Dr. Taylor. I don't think nobody in my full-time job actually knows who I am and what I do. I don't even, they just know me as Kristy, right?
We should wear our hats to the next one.
Yeah. But it's like, being able to break down the wall by just being personable with people. When you're facilitating stuff, you have to have your ground rules. You got to set your norms and expectation. You have to encourage those psychologically safe spaces, right? You have to foster environments where people, they feel comfortable, because that's when somebody's going to say, look, I grew up in California, that's when somebody's going to say, like, I'll say, look, I grew up in Mississippi. Listen, I'm gonna tell you this story. I've been in the military. I've done all of this stuff when I was younger. And I remember when I went to go for my job interview to work at a college for the first time. Now, when I got out of the military, this was in my 20s. I was teaching school in Del Rio, Texas, which I always tell people it was 2% black. Me and the brother that I was dating, right? And I decided, I was like, okay, I want to move out of K through 12 and go into higher ed. So this was 2010. Well, I wanted to go back into higher ed because I already had experience in higher ed working with my prior job in the military. But I got, so just to show you the lack of awareness, I was working on my PhD in global health. So that sets the tone, right? Working on my health science degree in global health, my PhD in global. I get on the plane. And I'm headed to Florida for this interview. And I see a person next to me who I thought was a brother. I say, hey, how you doing, brother? He speaks Spanish. Do you know that was the first time in my life I had seen somebody of brown skin tone speak Spanish? I was 27 years old. I always tell that story because, it's just like, you don't know what you don't know. Or the first time when I was working at the clinic when I was 19, and the first time I saw somebody named Jesus, but I'm sitting at the front of the clinic calling Jesus. You got to be able to tell stories to people, because that helps them to say, you know what, I just don't know what I don't know. Now, when we talking about in general on day to day, it's active listening. And when we talk about cultural awareness and listening, it's actually not just, we think about culture, we think about it in the context of race, right? But it actually is understanding your organizational culture, how that operates. It's also understanding that the differences in perspective based on gender, age group, life experience. Gen X is going to look at it different from, a millennial. You know what I'm saying? So we talk about culture. It's just like seeking to understand when we talk about facilitating that communication and being present, not just like I read a magazine article about gender differences and cultural differences, and now I know everything. No. And then also using inclusive language. And I want to be upfront with the inclusive language. That does not mean that you got to automatically skip. They're talking about like gender neutral terms, when appropriate, using preferred names, pronouns, and cultural identity. That does not mean that you got to come to me because you see me as a black woman. You come to me and you start speaking, yo, what's up, hip hop. That is not what that means in terms of relations. And I know I'm being funny tonight, but I promise you, this is just some of the stuff that I've encountered. But breaking down those walls, and then just being, having a sense of clarity, being clear, transparent, like, hey, I don't know all of this stuff, I'm trying, right? And then also be aware of your nonverbals, right? Because even though you're seeing one thing, you ever sit in a room where it's like something is happening and you don't understand it, and you're like, yes, you're like trying to give all the verbal clues, like, yes, I agree with what's going on, but it's obviously by your verbals that you don't understand and you totally disagree. People gonna pick up on that, but always just be open. Admit what you don't know. Don't feel like just because you read a book today that you're a guru on communication now. And always be open to continuously learning, and don't overdo it. I'm telling you, I've seen people overdo it, Sarah, when it comes to trying to relate culturally, whether it's to men to women, or somebody's gender, or somebody's sexuality, or somebody's age group. Like, you don't have to take it to the extreme in your way. Why don't you just, again, be human and be yourself, right? All right, so we've had a good bit of fun with that, but you know, you talk so much about, you gave so many good examples. Like, can you share, you know, an example of where conflict resolution it really just like led to a stronger team relationship?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a common occurrence, right? And what I think is so interesting about conflict resolution is that so many times when people start to try, if they start to try to figure it out, what they're really trying to solve are the symptoms of the conflict, not the actual conflict itself. So I had this team I was working with, and it was just like they had picked the most incompatible people ever to be on a working team. I don't know how they managed it, but they didn't have anything in common with like they didn't like the same sports teams, they didn't like the same food, they didn't like each other, they didn't like, and I'm like, wow, what are y'all doing on this working team? Who picked this team? This is terrible. But what it came down to was they didn't have any clarity around what they were supposed to be doing. So they were just picking at each other, trying to figure out, it was like a Lord of the Flies situation. Who's in charge? What are we supposed to be doing? Why are we here? It was like this existential crisis that was happening. And because they hadn't had strong leadership at all, like from the people, from the guy, it was a man in this case who organized this working team. And I was like, did you give them anything? Like, do they have a project goal? Like, what are they supposed to be accomplishing? Well, I want them to self-organize. Well, okay, that's great, but give them something to anchor on. So once we figured out like why he convened this team and what they were actually supposed to be working on, some of them were brand new to their careers. They didn't want to be seen as stupid, so they didn't want to ask any questions. It was just a dumpster fire of a situation. So we got rid of all of the ambiguity, figured out what they were supposed to be doing, who their actual stakeholders were in the conversation, like all the important stuff. And we did some really strong work around how to actually have conversations and ask questions that weren't, it wasn't about winning. They were meant to be working on a team together, right? No one individual was going to win some prize for like being the biggest whatever on the team. So once they kind of got past that mindset of I'm going to be the king of the hill, and they were able to somewhat come together as a team, they started to see that they did have some stuff in common. A couple of them had actually grown up not very far apart from each other, so they bonded over local weird food that was from their region. They found these common points that started to let them build around each other as opposed to fighting against each other. And I'm not going to say they became like the best team in the company, but they became functional. And I think that's really important because they were on the verge of getting fired. Like they were just, it was a disaster. And sometimes that's the only way out, is to like, cut the loss. But I'm glad that they were able to kind of put down the pitchforks and come to a place where they could accomplish a common goal and work together civilly. I think we're seeing that communication is a big piece of that, but also having the empathy to see each other as actual colleagues and not competition was really, really important on that. But there are lots of ways that empathy and accountability both can come together. Where have you seen that work in the spaces that you've been in?
It's exactly what you're saying. Because first of all, people will not always look. If you're a leader, sometimes, okay, so a couple of realistic scenarios, right? Sometimes stuff has to get done, but you notice that thing that has to get done is the anchor, right? And so you got to throw a team together of your people, and we're not necessarily worried about being friends. I think where the conversation with when we talk about this sensitive topic of DEI goes wrong is that people think that, I keep on going back to the therapy analogy, right? Because people think that because you're trying to promote inclusivity in the workplace that it has to be there, because sometimes it go a little too left. People like, I just didn't feel Sarah. Like that's because you've seseen it when we talk about these conversations.
Oh yeah,
people start getting that is a little too, and I think what has happened is people have taken that out of context and started to politicize it, right? But the realistic place of that is being centered in the middle, and it's like you said, having this understanding and dynamic of each other is really not. We don't have to be best friends. It's really just we're just trying to get to know each other for the sake of actually we're anchored on this topic. This is what brought us together, right? And through that process, we became we realized we got some things in common. I mean, it happens we both was in the military. It happens all the time in the military. You work with a bunch of people you don't know and do the process of just elimination after you go through that whole forming, norming, storm, whatever. Remember that, those 4, 5 steps. You really start to get to know people, because it's like in the military, it's so different, because I literally got to trust you with my life. A complete stranger.
Right.
I got to trust you with I got time to be touchy-feely. So that could be used as the argument, but you do actually do better a little bit when it comes to getting to know people. You get a little touchy-feely in the sense that you actually know who you're working with, right? To that extreme. So I think that, people just taking it all out of context, but then sometimes as facilitators, we let it run out of context when Sarah, when it starts just being like everything I say, you're sensitive about it. And I think people have just taken it and ran with it, and they let that be the face of what DEI is, when it's absolutely not, right? But whole thing about, just being empathetic and understanding, being accountable too. Like, just admit, like, I don't know, but I don't know. I'm learning. I'm human. I mean, I don't know everything. I mean, we met when I was doing these DEI roundtables last year in this mental health conference, I don't know. It was a learning experience for me. My sister just calls me a facilitator. She's like, "You are so good at bringing people together, right? You just do stuff. You can bring people together and be like, we're about to do this. Just like we said, we're gonna do this podcast, right? We're gonna just pop up and do it." But that don't mean that I was like, that didn't mean that I knew everything or everybody's perspective or understood everybody's perspective. You know what I mean? Coming to the stage. I mean, I'm a straight Black woman from the country hills of Mississippi, grew up in a Baptist, so it's just like, but I think doing that type of work has definitely broadened my perspective. It has helped me to grow. And I think that's all we have to do is be accountable to each other, be empathetic, not overly sensitive where you feel like everything is, needs to go deep, So listen, if you're a leader and you are setting, if you're a leader and you're going to do this team thing, you got a team, and then you got to have something to anchor. You got to set clear expectations. You got to encourage feedback. And just because we encourage everybody to be open, that does not mean, again, that you have to go picture it Cicely 19. I was taking this acting class one day. You know what? Remember when you went to that acting class and I followed you and did the boot camp, and we were just supposed to be doing a storytelling. And I mean, this one person was just like, they said, pick a time of your life, but it turned into a therapy session. I was like, I think it was just supposed to be like a funny story, but yours turned into picturely 1820. I don't think that we were supposed to go back that far. That's a little bit. I think what more so we needed a therapy session, not a, I don't know if we're supposed to go that far, but sometimes it gets that far, right? And we just have to recognize when to reel it back in. And then just also the last thing we're going to say on that is that, when you say something, follow through, and then make sure that you celebrate them small wins of just, when you're doing things and addressing challenges in the workplace, that you're recognizing effort and improvement. This has been a great conversation. Let me turn it over to you, Sarah, for your final thoughts. I've been talking way too much. It was the pork chop today. It was a hot sauce that got me a little spicy.
I like it. I think it's important to remember that when we're talking about transforming workplaces, that is not a light switch moment. You don't do a workshop or a session and ta-da, everything is better. It's gonna be a journey. And I know that word gets used a lot and it gets misused a lot, but it's real. It's going to take some time. It's going to take a whole lot of effort. And it's going to take somebody who is willing to stand there and hold the vision for what you're trying to accomplish intact and figure out how to problem solve along the way. So if you are not willing to do that hard work, then don't put your team through the effort. Just stick with whatever status quo you've got. But if you're going to make a change, recognize it's going to be a lot of work. It's also going to be worth it. So do the work and make sure that it actually comes to fruition. Otherwise, everybody's just been miserable for no good reason. And that is not worth it for anybody.
Miserable for no good reason. And I also want to just end it, came out there by saying, like, listen, we're trainers. So I have to say, training is not the answer to everything. Like, you can't just workshop people to death. You can't just, you can't actually. Problem. Let's do a workshop. Let's get everybody together. And that's where, have you ever done an OD event and then it's like, you're supposed to be facilitating this conversation, then it all starts to go left because then you realize it's like, it's actually probably something to do with the leader, with the policies, is all of these things, right? And then it's like, you know, you have you ever ask a question? It's like you open up a can of worms because one person starts saying how they feel, not everybody's saying how they feel, and it's like, wait, hold up. You know, you
I'm not charging enough for this.
Yeah. So, you know, so just know this, like what Sarah said, man, this is a process. It is you're basically gonna be the turtle in this race with the hare, right? You gotta, it's quality over quantity. Anyway, we have one more episode to go in this special series. I'm just gonna make the statement that we're gonna go ahead and record it tonight, and by the time you see this, it'll be 2 episodes. So I'm not gonna pretend to change clothes in the next episode like I did. But it's been such a great, you know, conversation, such a breath of fresh air. And we're gonna see you guys in the next episode. So drink, eat, and intelligent conversations. Cheers to us. And thank you so much, Sarah.
Thanks, Kristy. See you soon.
All right.